Good evening, and welcome to the McConnell Center's first virtual talk of 2021. We're honored to host U.S. Representative John Yarmuth this evening for a conversation on the federal budget. Before I turn over the stage to our moderator and distinguished guest, I'd like to briefly introduce the McConnell Center and highlight a few housekeeping rules. My name is Ben Barberie, and I'm a senior McConnell Scholar at the University of Louisville, where I am studying political science and economics. This year marks the 30th anniversary of the McConnell Center, which was established at UofL in 1991 by U.S. Senator Mitch McConnell and university officials as a scholarship program to attract and retain Kentucky's best and brightest to the university. Over the past 3 decades, the center, a recognized oasis of excellence in higher education, has expanded its leadership development to include a robust public lecture series, hundreds of engaging civic and military education programs, and an ever-expanding digital education library consisting of podcasts and interviews with leading authors and public officials. We're honored that you've joined us this evening, and we hope you continue to join us at future events. Please note that tonight's lecture is being recorded and will be posted online with our archived lectures at mcconnellcenter.org. Please keep your microphones on mute, and lastly, feel free to submit questions and comments at any time in the chat area. Tonight's talk is part of a year-long McConnell Center public lecture series focused on themes and events related to the U.S. Constitution. It is inspired by the McConnell Center's recent publication of Reflection and Choice, which presents all 85 Federalist Papers alongside excerpts from anti-Federalist writings. Please visit mcconnellcenter.org to learn more about the book, our reading guide, and our companion podcast series. As some of you may know, this year's lecture series is dedicated to Carmen Thompson, a beloved social studies teacher and great friend of the McConnell Center who passed away last summer. To help share in Carmen's memory and speak more about her dedication to her students and her profession, I'd like to welcome Angela Burton, a social studies teacher at West Jessamine Middle School. Angela?
Thank you, Ben, and good evening to everyone. And thank you for allowing me to take just a moment to share some memories of Carmen. In 2003, I was a much younger, inexperienced social studies teacher. And at the time, my school required that all of my accelerated social studies students complete a National History Day project. And so somehow, some of them made it past the regional competition and ended up in the state competition. And it was there that I met Carmen Thompson in 2003. And it was there that I met a dynamic teacher and just a teacher full of passion for students and social studies and just life in general. And not to brag, but to thank Carmen and other dedicated teachers like herself who inspired me as a young teacher. Some of my students were able to hold their own with hers in the competition, and we actually got to travel to Maryland, to College Park and participate in the national competition. And we won't talk about the results there, but so several years later, our paths happened to meet again, cross again, through the McConnell Center and the Teacher Scholars Program. And it was in this program that I got to know Carmen on a personal level, not just a professional level. And just as her professional practice years early left a mark on me as a teacher, personally, her exuberant personality and just her penchant for having a good time left a huge mark on me personally as well. And even at a time when I joined the McConnell Center Teacher Scholars Program as a new mom, trying to do what was best for both my family and my passion in my career, Carmen was very helpful in reminding us why we do what we do as teachers. And it's no surprise that in 2015, the Kentucky Historical Society awarded her the Patricia Beering Teacher of the Year Award. And I just can't thank her personally enough for just her zeal and her love for teaching and students and just what she left me with in those memories, as she did many of you. And I just appreciate you letting me speak about her. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your very kind words. Carmen clearly brought so much enthusiasm to everyone around her and is greatly missed by her friends, students, and colleagues. It's now my honor to introduce tonight's moderator, Dr. Jasmine Farrier, and our guest of honor, Congressman Yarmuth. Dr. Farrier is the Vice President for Advancement at the University of Louisville and a past chair of the Department of Political Science. She is an expert on all three branches of U.S. government and is the author of a new book on interbranch lawsuits, separation of powers, and constitutional law. She will lead a McConnell Center virtual talk on constitutional dysfunction on trial in March, and we hope that you'll join us for that event. Congressman Yarmuth represents Kentucky's 3rd Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives. Now in his 8th term, he has served as chairman of the House Budget Committee since 2017. Born and raised in Louisville, Kentucky, Congressman Yarmuth graduated from Atherton High School and Yale University. After their conversation, Congressman Yarmuth has agreed to take questions from the audience. We encourage those on Zoom to submit questions and comments anytime throughout the talk in the chat area. Dr. Farrier, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ben. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here with not only our chairman, the only representative of the 3rd District of Kentucky, but also I see so many current and former students. Of course, you're all my favorites, and so many wonderful colleagues from across UofL. Thank you, Dr. Gregg, for this opportunity, and thank you to all of the supporters here tonight. I'm going to ask the chairman some questions that may be familiar because he and I have been speaking about them for over a year and for years before that, as he has been very willing to be a co-teacher, a co-lecturer in my American Congress class, and also was a co-lecturer in my separation of powers seminar last year. I say with pride that the chairman showed up in person and then migrated online, and we think the entire nation benefited from his teaching his colleagues that you can conduct a lot of really interesting meetings over this medium. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome back to UofL.
Thank you very much. It's great to be part of the program and be with the McConnell Center. And I will say, and you know that I'm not just sucking up, but being a co-teacher and getting to spend time with the great students at UofL has been one of the true joys of my congressional life. And it's one of the things that makes me happiest these days. And there are not many, I will say.
Well, we are really honored and certainly flattered by that. And it's really important that students at UofL know that one of our most important missions is to take your education out of the classroom into experiential learning. And I know that there are students who are listening here who would be interested in hearing more about internships. And we've had a large group of proud cardinals, not just on the Democratic side, working for the chairman. Of course, we have proud cardinals at the local, state, and federal level right now, working across the aisle, both parties. And I would be very happy to help students connect with the right people at UofL and with alumni mentors to get your resume out of the classroom and into your first step outside. So let's start off with our questions. Mr. Chairman, when you think about your many hats as a representative, you are representing the 3rd District. You say you represent those who didn't vote for you as well. You're also a member of the House of Representatives, which is part of the Congress, the only national legislative body. When you are thinking about how to go into Congress, how to vote, and how to choose what committee you want to begin and then continue with your career, how do you choose? So in other words, tell us how you view representation, both again for the district and for the nation, and how does that choice influence what committees you've chosen to sit on?
Well, thanks for the question. I got to think back now, 14 plus years. No, I look at the Constitution first, and my first duty is to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So my first obligation, I feel, is to the country as a whole. I understand clearly that I have representative responsibilities for my district and for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. But I always think first of the national interest before anything else, because again, that's the role the Constitution prescribed for me.
And why the,
So going back to, yeah, so the history of my uh, committee life has been somewhat interesting because when I was elected, I always said my goal was to be on the Ways and Means Committee because that was the most important committee, the most powerful committee in the House, in my opinion. So that was the first marker I laid down, but I knew I wasn't going to get on Ways and Means Committee as a newly elected member. So I thought about the things that that I really was interested in pursuing, and one of the issues that I was always very interested in was education. So I sought a position on the Education and Labor Committee because obviously education has both national, state, and local implications, and also I was I was supported to a large extent by organized labor in my first campaign, and the Education and Labor Committee also had jurisdiction over labor law. So I had kind of mixed, that had a mixed appeal to me and a pull to me. And then I sought a position on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, primarily because I knew that a man named Henry Waxman was chairman. I knew that he was going to be very aggressive in his oversight of the Bush administration, and I wanted to be part of that. And so those were my two committees as a freshman. My second term, I was able to get on Ways and Means Committee, which I was very happy about. And one of the things that the Ways and Means Committee does is it has 3 automatic seats on the Budget Committee. So in our first organizational meeting, when we choose our try to get on our subcommittees and so forth, we also had the spots designated for the Budget Committee, and two of the spots were taken, and nobody else wanted the third spot. So as the most junior member on the Democratic side of the committee at that point, they basically said, "Okay, Yarmuth, you're on the Budget Committee," and so began my my life on the Budget Committee. I've been there ever since, and after a few terms, I decided that it was not only something that interested me, but also it was something that I might be able eventually to play a leadership role in. And so that planning all worked out. I lost my seat on the Ways and Means Committee after the 2010 election because we lost the majority, and so the ratios on the committees changed, and I, along with some others, lost our seats. Ultimately, I kept my seat on the Budget Committee. I ultimately got a seat on the Energy and Commerce Committee, which I finally concluded was a better committee than the Ways and Means Committee, actually, because the subject matter is so fascinating. And I mean, it involves healthcare and communications, and certainly the world of communications in this day and age is a phenomenal subject. And so I spent that time, but when I was made chairman of the Budget Committee, I had to give up my seat on the Energy and Commerce Committee. I have a right of return, so if I ever decide to leave the Budget Committee, and I could go back on the Energy and Commerce Committee, but being a committee chairman is pretty special, and but that's the history of my committee life.
Thank you. So please tell us, in as simple terms as possible, what is the difference between the different financially related committees? So the Ways and Means Committee in the House is called the Finance Committee in the Senate. And that, of course, is taxing, entitlements, and you can explain more about that. The Appropriations Committees have discretion over annual appropriations, which is less than a third of the budget. Then the Budget Committee. So tell us, what really are the differences between these, and why is the Budget Committee so important right now in this year?
Well, thanks. The Budget Committee was created in 1974. It's one of the youngest committees in Congress, and it's a committee that has often been discussed by some members as something we ought to do away with. But the Budget Committee has one fundamental role according to its creating statute, and that is to approve a budget resolution which sets limits for discretionary spending. And discretionary spending is about the roughly 30% of the federal budget that the Congress has discretion over. The remaining 70% is what's called mandatory spending. And that essentially is Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and the interest on the debt, and a few other programs where, but the idea is that the program's created, if you qualify for the program, the spending is whatever it is. So however many people are eligible for Medicare, that's what the spending is. Whatever the Social Security population and benefits are, that's what the spending is. So we have no control over that unless we want to change the program or change eligibility or whatever we might want to do. But so every year we start the budget process in the budget committee by setting what's called a top line number. And that's how much are we going to spend overall on discretionary spending. It's roughly 1.4 something trillion right now. And how much of that goes to defense spending and how much goes to non-defense spending. So non-defense is a little more than half of all the discretionary. I mean, defense is a little more than half of all the discretionary spending. It's about $780 billion a year right now. Then everything else the government does is in that other half. So housing, education, veterans, well, you name it. Everything else, the FBI, most of the federal agencies funding, all of that comes, foreign aid, it all comes in what's non-defense discretionary spending. And so we set that top line number every year and break it out as to defense and non-defense and other accounts. And then our job is done. Now, it rarely works as cleanly as I just described it, but that's the way it's supposed to work in theory. Once we set that number, and then the Appropriations Committee takes that number, and then they figure out how all of that $1.4 trillion is going to be spent down to a pretty minute detail. In some cases, a few millions of dollars. In some cases, maybe even tens of thousands of dollars. And there are 12 subcommittees in the Appropriations Committee. The chairman and chairwomen of those subcommittees are called cardinals because of the power they have. And they essentially divvy out the money and say, this is where this is going to be spent. Now, the same process goes on in the Senate. And ultimately, the Senate and the House have to pass the same spending measure. And again, it rarely works out cleanly like that, but that's on paper the way we operate. And then the other committees, the committees such as the Energy and Commerce Committee, the Education Committee, the Veterans Committee, the Science and Technology Committee, you just name the Interior, Natural Resources, it's called, committee. They are all called authorizing committees. And the authorizing committees every year put out a piece of legislation that does two things. It sets a cap on what can be spent for the areas, the programs in their jurisdiction, and then they change policy for those. So the Defense Subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee not only figures out the authorizing committee, it's the Armed Services Committee, they set an overall cap. So it'll be in this case, $770 billion, or whatever it is. And then they set policy. So they may change the don't ask, don't tell policy. They may change the healthcare policies that affect the various branches of the government, of the military and the soldiers. And so they're involved in the actual budgeting process and spending process, but they also make policy for the areas in their jurisdiction. So that's essentially how it's supposed to work. And then all that gets wrapped up in a nice little bow, and president signs it. And then the Office of Management and Budget, which is part of the administration, actually implements all of the spending decisions that were made as part of that process.
Thank you. So we hear a lot about partisan differences in the House and Senate. So I think this might be a very good education, maybe for the first time, for some of the people listening, about how important the division of labor is across the House and Senate through committees. But going to the partisan differences, how can you summarize the real day-to-day partisan differences on fiscal policy, which is taxing and spending policy, for lack of a more elegant term, monetary policy, which is the supply of money and interest rates, and regulatory policy, which is how we tell the private sector and government regarding everything from hiring and firing to how we test water, to pollution, and of course, discrimination and other ways of regulating private businesses. So again, the question is, what are the main partisan differences on all three areas that impact economic life?
All right.
Fiscal, monetary, and regulatory.
I'll take the easiest one first. Regulatory is the easiest one.
Okay.
Because there's generally been a very clear distinction, at least in modern history, as to regulations. Republicans are against regulations and Democrats are for them. Now, that's not always been the case. When Richard Nixon was president in the early 1970s, he was able to get past the creation of the Environmental Protection Act, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, a lot of very strong regulatory programs that today virtually all Republicans resist and probably would have blocked and if he had tried to propose them in modern times. With monetary policy, it's a little bit different. Monetary policy is generally thought to be the prerogative of the Federal Reserve. That is the central bank in the United States. That is the bank, that is the institution that decides how much currency to put into the economy, how much debt that the country should incur. And they have a mission that's twofold. And it's very clear their mission is to promote full employment and low inflation. And everything they do with their policies, their monetary policies, the issuance of money or the contraction of money out of the system, is done to achieve those two basic goals. And that leaves fiscal policy. And fiscal policy is spending and taxing. And that's the Congress's prerogative. And I would say that for most of the last 40 years or 50 years, partisanship has not been as significant a factor, primarily because while sometimes Republicans would balk about spending too much, they always wanted to spend money on certain things. They wanted to spend money on the things they liked, and they didn't want to spend money on the things they didn't like. So Republicans have always wanted to spend as much as possible on defense and as little as possible on non-defense spending, domestic spending. And Democrats have been the opposite. That has made for a healthy tension because basically, unless the partisan balance in the Congress was overwhelming in one side or the other, then you made trade-offs. And Democrats would say, all right, and we've done this just in the last few years, we have a deal. If you want to increase defense spending, we're going to increase defense spending by the same amount, non-defense spending by the same amount. So that's one way in which partisanship has been overcome. The fact that both parties want to spend money in some areas, and they know that if that they can't do what they want to do unless they do what they don't want to do, agree to what they don't want to do. And that works both ways. The other way partisanship is overcome is, at least until the last 10 or 12 years, is we used to have what are called earmarks. And earmarks are, we like to call them congressionally designated investments. That's the way, but because earmarks is a bad name. which it shouldn't be, but that's where members of Congress get to designate individual projects and expenditures for their districts or their states. And we use them aggressively, and that most of the time when we had earmarks, we had a very overwhelming bipartisan vote for the ultimate appropriations bills because everybody had something in there for their districts. And they were cut out, I believe, in 2010. May not be, is that right, Jasmine? I think when after John Boehner became speaker after the 2010 election. And that was a real mistake because it eliminated that that other path to overcoming partisanship. And it actually, I think it hurt the country because what we've always, those of us who have supported earmarks always said was, if you don't have earmarks, you've turned over the allocation of all that money to bureaucrats who don't know they don't know the districts, they don't know the states nearly as well as the representatives. And when earmarks were in place, they generally would be about 15% of any particular program. So if we had a senior housing program, for instance, that was, let's say it was a $2 billion program, 15% of that would be subject to earmarks. The rest of it would go through the normal, what we call competitive process, where people are drafting grants and sending grants requests into grant submissions into the whatever agency was responsible, and then the bureaucrats did that. So anyway, right now the partisanship has basically been more rhetorical than it's actually been practical. So right now we're debating, there's this relief plan, COVID relief. The Biden administration has put forth a $1.9 billion plan, and the Republicans, most of whom are resisting that, saying we can't afford it. We can't spend that much money. We just spent $900 billion in December. We can't spend any more now, or as much now. And Democrats are saying no. We have to go big. We've got a national crisis and so forth. So there is a partisan debate going on right now, but I don't think it's a real debate. I think it's more posturing, political partisan posturing than it is related to substance.
Well, speaking of substance, I'm going to share my screen for just a moment to wake everybody up to what are considered to be very frightening realities. So there are lots of websites out there, such as this one called the U.S. Debt Clock. So a person can lose a little bit of sleep thinking about the amount of money that the United States government is spending that we are not taking in through tax revenue and other sources of revenue. But with the help of this book, which I will now show everybody, which is The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton, it appears that our fear of deficits and debt, so debt is the accumulation of all deficits annually since the beginning of the second Constitution, it's a myth. Do you subscribe to what Stephanie Kelton calls modern monetary theory, Mr. Chairman?
I've pretty much been converted.
Okay.
Yes. And I was very skeptical when I started reading about modern monetary theory several years ago. And it seemed to me that it was, and I'll get into it a little bit more in a second, but it seemed to me that it was a great idea until it didn't work. And to a certain extent, that's true. That's still the case. But what modern monetary theory holds is that when you are, as a country, you are a sovereign, you have a sovereign currency. In other words, you transact all your business in your own currency, and you don't borrow in anybody else's currency, and you don't peg it to another currency or to something like gold, because once we were on the gold standard and the dollar had an amount pegged to gold, we did away with that a long time ago. But once you are a sovereign currency, and there are I won't get all of them, but we have that. Great Britain has that. Brazil has it. Japan has it. China has it. There may be a couple of others. The European Union does not have it because they all use the euro. But if you have a sovereign currency, then you can basically spend anything you want to spend. The only constraint being if you spend more than the economy can absorb. And I'll give you an example of that. Let's say we passed a program in Congress to give everybody in the country $200,000 to buy a house. Every family got $200,000. We could do that. We could essentially issue the currency to do that. What would happen though? The price of housing would go way up because everybody would be bidding on a finite supply of housing. So all of a sudden, a $200,000 house is a $500,000 house. That's not good for anybody, and it actually defeats the purpose of the program. So that's the one constraint, and what those who the proponents of modern monetary theory will say, if it gets out of control and we put too much money into the economy and inflation starts going wild, Congress has to stop it. Congress has to fix it. That's kind of the catch, because we know Congress is not necessarily good at doing the things it needs to do often. So, but at this point in time, I think virtually everybody the real serious economists, from the most liberal to the most conservative, are saying we can afford to do much more than we're doing. We have plenty of what we call fiscal space to do the kinds of things which we need to do right now. And that includes Jerome Powell as chairman of the Federal Reserve, who's a Republican appointee, Douglas Holtz-Eakin, a very conservative deficit hawk who was director of the Congressional Budget Office. So on that side, and then you even look at the Wall Street economists who normally would be, I think, afraid of significant increases in the national debt because of what it might do to interest rates and relative value of investments. And they're all saying they believe the same thing, that we have plenty of room to spend what we need to spend right now. And that if we don't, then the consequences long-term are worse than than the increase in the debt right now. So it's the problem with modern monetary theory is that most people think of budgets in their personal frame of reference. So they think of it as a household budget, and or as a state legislator might think the state budget. Most states have a constitutional prohibition of going into debt, a deficit spending. So you think of it in contexts which don't apply to the federal government. And what Stephanie Kelton says is that the federal government is the issuer of money. Everyone else, every company, every individual, every local and state government, they are users of the money. And she also uses the metaphor of monopoly, that in every monopoly game, there's a banker, and the banker gives out the money. And no matter how many times you pass go, the banker keeps paying, right? The $200 every time you pass go. And if the banker runs out of money, the banker actually writes out on a blank piece of paper. That's according to the rules of monopoly. So she makes that analogy, and I think it's a pretty good one. And I think there are more and more people who believe that this is the case. We had a hearing last year in the Budget Committee, just about a year ago, and the subject of the hearing was, does debt matter? And we had a variety of economists there. We had 3 witnesses that the Democrats did, the Republicans had 1, and basically they all said the same thing. No, debt doesn't matter right now. And so when you hear debates over how much we should be spending in this crisis that we're in, or can we afford a major infrastructure program, or can we afford to change student loan debt in the country, whether it's forgiving debt or some other way, yes, we can afford to do all that right now. And we can afford to do it until prices go up. And the one, I actually had a conversation with the director of CBO, Congressional Budget Office, a couple weeks ago. And I asked him, and I have not yet asked Stephanie, but I'm going to, how much does the accumulated debt affect the possibility of inflation, or does it? And he didn't know. I mean, his first response was, I don't know that. And he's a real smart guy. So he's gonna do some work on that. So, the question is, if you're $27 trillion in debt as a nation, or you're $35 trillion or $40 trillion, is the next dollar you spend any more likely to cause inflation? And I don't know the answer to that. Phil Schwagel, who's director of CBO, didn't know the answer to that. And I'm going to ask Stephanie Kelton and see if she does.
Thank you. I'm going to post the book in the chat as soon as I ask this next question. So,
yeah. And by the way, for everybody who's watching, if you're interested in this subject, it is the least wonky economics book that you will ever read. It is incredibly readable and understandable. It's written for non-economists, I'll guarantee you that.
Yes, but our putting it in the chat does not necessarily mean that it's endorsed by any institutional officials at the University of Louisville. I just put in the chat. So it sounds like if we ascribe to modern monetary theory, divisions on the deficit and debt may cease, but we will still have extraordinary policy divisions about, say, whether the United States should mandate increased spending for social policy, for Black and white wealth gaps, for reparations for slavery, for climate crisis spending, for infrastructure, preschool, anything every day that we hear about. These policy divisions are not always about the bottom line. They're actually about much deeper fissures between what we think the government is responsible for at the federal level versus the states versus the local, what individuals are responsible for, what corporations are responsible for, and what are the limits of enforcement that may infringe upon what we believe are our natural liberties. Can you comment on that? It's not just about money for everything. There are still these other differences. Should we overcome them, or is the division itself the dialogue over constitutional and national values?
Well, I think in almost every area except defense, which is, clearly enumerated in the Constitution as a responsibility. Well, defense and immigration are the two areas. There may be another one or two, but the primary areas where they are clearly the responsibility of the federal government. There is an ongoing debate over who has the most responsibility for, say, education or childcare or infrastructure or housing. And for instance, in education, K through 12 education, the federal government pays about 10% of all the funding for education across the country. So when the federal government tries to make policy for how K through 12 education should be conducted across the country, states say, well, wait a minute. Some states say, wait a minute, we're putting up 90% of the money and we know how to educate our kids, and that's our responsibility. Stay out of our turf, stay off our turf. And so there are debates like that in almost every area of society, where the fundamental question is, whose primary responsibility is it? Is it the federal government's? To the extent that government is involved, is it the federal government, state government, or local government? We're having that same debate right now with police policy, where with Black Lives Matter, and how much can the federal government do to reform policing in the country to deal with racial, systemic racism in policing? And it's a real good question. And there's a limit as to what we can do. So in general, Republicans always, historically, Republicans have said, this is these are the prerogatives of states and local governments. They're closest to their citizens. They know best. the federal government should stay out of it. Democrats have tended to believe that the federal government should have a role because it will equalize the shortcomings or the discrepancies, I should say, disparities among the states as to how they act. So, for instance, in the field of education, under the Bush administration, George W. Bush, we passed, I wasn't there yet then, but we passed something called No Child Left Behind. It was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, but better known as No Child Left Behind. And the theory behind that was, yeah, we can let the states do what they want to do, but if Mississippi is spending X dollars, well, if Massachusetts is spending X dollars per pupil and Mississippi is spending X minus $10,000 a student, then the people of Mississippi are getting a raw deal. Their leadership is not helping them, and they're American citizens, and they need to be guaranteed a quality education. So that was the premise upon which No Child Left Behind was built, and that comes up all the time in a wide variety of areas. So I think another example of kind of the conflicts there, climate change is a perfect example. The federal government cannot solve climate change by itself. We can spend another $27 trillion. We will not solve climate change by ourselves. We have a role to play, and there are things we can do, but it's going to take the non-government sector, it's going to take the private sector, it's going to take individual families doing what they can do to cut carbon emissions and so forth. So, and those are really interesting discussions that unfortunately aren't usually conducted in a calm, nuanced fashion. They're generally people just screaming at each other from various perspectives, or denying climate change, which is one thing. But again, and that's true in so many areas. In education, there's this element of the public that thinks we ought to have charter schools, non-public schools, because that gives students more choices as to how they're educated, and so that's the education, essentially private sector education. Then you've got the whole debate over public prisons and private prisons. So again, you can look at almost any area, and these debates occur at various levels.
Well, thank you. I want to ask one more broad question. We'll keep it brief, and then we're going to do a lightning round because there are so many good questions about specific policy coming up right now in the 117th Congress.
I'm very wordy. I'll get less wordy.
Okay. No. Professors speak in 75-minute increments as well.
Right.
So, but this is more of a philosophical question because I want people to understand what the chairman is saying, that partisan differences are not the limit to philosophical differences about the role of government in our lives. Nor does the deficit and debt limit how we disagree on things. So that's the general nature of these past two questions. Right. But I want to go a little bit deeper. Again, this will be a brief one. The Congress is a collection of independently elected House members and senators. Everyone who sits in Congress is a winner, whether or not they're in the majority or the minority. Their constituents sent them there. Is this collection of Democrats, Republicans, and independents that literally do come across all of the states have a better understanding of the, quote, national interest than one president representing one party who may have won by a slim margin or a broad mandate? Why do we think, and this goes back to one of the earlier questions about the line item veto that Fred asked, why do people assume that presidents somehow see the organic national interest better than the collection of representatives who come from the diversity and both parties across the United States?
Well, the simple kind of textbook answer would be the president of the United States has to campaign all over the country. And in campaigning all over the country, gets a better feel for the diversity and the diverse interests and how they can be balanced. I think in reality, it depends on the individual. I don't think the textbook answer applies. It also depends on who you're talking about. So if you're, and I don't want to pick on Wyoming, But if you're the senator from Wyoming, one of the senators, or if you're the congressperson from Wyoming, you have no clue how the rest of the country operates. Absolutely not. You are in a state that is as unrepresentative of the rest of the country as you could possibly be. You have 500,000 people, you have more sheep than people. You don't have an urban area of note in your entire state. Your biggest city is probably 60,000 people. And yet you're supposed to look out for the national interest, but you can't. On the other hand, if you're from Pennsylvania, if you're from Texas, if you're from Florida, if you're from New York, you have basically all of the elements that exist in the national society. And you have a much better feel for even some members of the House. You have a better feel for what the country needs and how the country works than if you're the senator from Wyoming, if you're the senator from Montana, South Dakota, a lot of these states, which are 98% white, almost entirely rural, and so agrarian. And so again, I think the textbook answer would be the president, but I don't think President Trump had a very good idea of what the country was like. But I'm sure there were Democratic presidents I could probably say the same thing about.
All right, so in our final 15 minutes or so, Ben or Connor, how much time do we have left? Do we end at 7?
Connor, I believe we're slated to go a little longer than that, aren't we?
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
till 7:30.
7:30, great. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to start taking questions that were pre-submitted as well as in the chat, and then we'll add some more and just continue. So these are going to be our lightning round questions, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
What is your role in increasing the minimum wage as part of a reconciliation bill? And we'll start with that. So first, this is a little bit more of a complex yes or no question, because you have to explain what is reconciliation, how it gets around the filibuster in the Senate, why it's appropriate for presidents or for members to propose it, and where you stand on this issue, both raising the minimum wage in general and using your budget committee's special tools to get it through.
Okay, yeah, this is not going to be a short answer.
I said lightning round.
Lightning round. Okay, so in the Budget Act, I hope everybody out there knows about the filibuster in the Senate. You need, essentially, in today's world, you need 60 votes to get anything passed. Now we have a 50-50 split right now in the Senate. So unless something weird happens, basically no bill can be voted on. In the Budget Act of 1974, the process of reconciliation was created as a way to bypass the filibuster and to allow something to come to the floor where it only took a simple majority to pass the Senate. Again, relates only to the Senate, not to the House. Although the reconciliation process involves the House. So it was originally designed as a deficit reduction tool. That was the purpose of putting in that if we were running too big a deficit and we needed to act we needed to act quickly, that we would have this process that makes sure we could get something done if it reduced the deficit. However, the statute doesn't say reduce the deficit. that was the rationale, but it doesn't say that. So you can actually pass something under the reconciliation process that makes the deficit worse. The Republicans in 2017 used reconciliation to pass their tax cut. It added about $2 trillion to the debt. Democrats in 2010, we passed the Affordable Care Act with reconciliation, although the Congressional Budget Office score, which is they decide how it affects the budget, they said it actually did reduce the deficit. But what we're proposing next week, we will be proposing a COVID relief package that will spend $1.9 trillion, and it will clearly increase the deficit. And it will go to things. It's basically the President Biden's plan. It will fund the acquisition and distribution of vaccines, COVID-19 vaccines. It will fund schools so they can reopen. It will provide money to state and local governments to keep our frontline workers on the job. It will provide a $1,400 check to every adult making $75,000 or less. It will extend unemployment insurance federal supplements, which now expire March 14th. We'll extend them, I forget exactly how long, another 2.5 months, I think. So there's a variety of things. And one of the things that's proposed by President Biden that we will have, I believe we will have in our reconciliation motion, raising the minimum wage by $15 an hour. So we will pass next week what's called a budget resolution with reconciliation instructions. So we will, and this gets real wonky, but we will instruct certain committees to spend certain amounts of money on certain things. Then once we pass that, the Senate will pass the identical budget resolution. Over the ensuing 2 weeks, the various committees that we have instructed will actually write legislation to spend money. So the Education and Labor Committee will draft legislation that will raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. It will draft legislation to allocate, I think it's $85 billion to schools across the country to help them reopen safely. So all the different committees will do that. They will send it back to us. We put it together in a big bill. It goes to the floor, where in both the House and Senate, it gets passed by a simple majority. It cannot be filibustered in the Senate. Now, there is one restriction on what we do but with budget reconciliation, and that is something called the Byrd Rule, which was put into effect by Senator Robert Byrd from West Virginia many years ago. And what it basically said is, if you use reconciliation, you can't use it to make policy. And you can't use it to do something that has only an incidental impact on the budget. So if you were doing, say, just the one pops into my head, don't ask, don't tell, that has no budgetary implications at all. So that would not clear the Byrd Rule. The $15 an hour is kind of interesting because it has some impact on the federal budget, but not very much, because most federal employees already make $15 an hour. So the estimate is that it will only be in the low single digits of billions. Most of the impacts in the private sector. So we anticipate, we don't care about that in the House because we don't have a Byrd Rule. So we can put anything in the budget resolution we want. In the Senate, though, somebody will definitely raise an objection under the Byrd Rule to putting the $15 minimum wage in the bill. Then the parliamentarian, the Senate, decides whether it conforms with the Byrd Rule or not. If she decides that it doesn't comply with the Byrd Rule, it either gets taken out, or there is the president of the Senate, who will be the vice president of the United States, Kamala Harris, can then overrule the ruling of the parliamentarian. And then there'll be a vote on whether to overturn the ruling of the chair. That's the kind of the course it would take. There's several things in this bill in the reconciliation bill that are, I would say, challenging in terms of clearing the Byrd Rule. One of them is paid family leave, which again has very little impact on the federal budget, a significant impact outside of it. So that's the process, and we can, we're doing it on the theory that we have an immediate need for funding, and we cannot to get out to the states to combat the virus and to limit the economic consequences for families based on the pandemic, and that we can't allow partisanship to stop providing the help that the country needs. And there are some things that a lot of Republicans support that are in the president's proposal, and there are other things they don't. So, so we're on one track with reconciliation. Meanwhile, they're trying to get a bipartisan agreement. The president is, where we can actually go through the normal process and pass a relief package that doesn't require this process. But that's reconciliation in as briefly as I can do it,
It's a complicated
where
process.
people can have some understanding of it.
Well, I'm glad that you're taking the time, because I think people may not understand that there is a method behind the obstacle course that is the legislative process. But let's move on to social policy, and I'll bundle these questions into a thundercloud, if you will. So we've gotten questions about SNAP benefits and whether those will be increased by legislation or executive order. Let's continue on with reinstating the individual mandate that Republicans claimed victory when it was taken out through the 2017 tax legislation. So again, one is SNAP benefits. Two is the individual mandate as part of the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. Three, there was a question in the chat about child care deserts, which it may be a phrase that people are not as familiar with as food deserts. Let's just take those three social policies that may or may not be in the purview of your committee, but where do they all stand right now in the House and Senate?
Okay, well, SNAP was something that we actually dealt with in all of the prior relief bills, both in the CARES Act, the HEROES Act, which was passed last May, not passed by the Republican Senate. Bill we passed in October, I forget what we called that one, but we had a 15% increase in SNAP benefits. That was not in the $900 billion plan legislation that passed at the end of December. The president is trying to do that by executive order right now. He may have already done it, I'm not sure, but he said he was going to increase SNAP benefits. So that's being handled, I think. Let's see, childcare. That's something that the president has said he wants in this package. I don't remember exactly how much is in it for childcare, but the theory being that in order to, when schools are closed and parents have to take care of their kids, they can't get back to work if their kids are at home. So there is a definite connection between the pandemic and the need for childcare. It's a much bigger subject than that. We have there is an almost inexcusable lack of affordable health care almost anywhere in the country. I mean, childcare, almost everywhere in the country, and it's something that we absolutely have to attack as a country. And again, it's not my jurisdiction of my committee, but it's something that I care deeply about. I believe that we absolutely have to have a federal commitment to early childhood education, starting at 2 or 2.5 years old. That will deal with a lot of the child care deficiencies. But in Europe, children start going to school full time at 2.5 years old, 3 years old. So just doing 5 years old or even to 4 is not enough. And we've got to make sure that we give a sound educational foundation to every child in this country, or we're not going to have an educated workforce in a generation. And it's a national crisis. We don't talk about it much. We tend to spend a lot of time on K through 12 and no offense, Jasmine, but higher ed. But I urge anybody, if you could ever get a chance, go visit something called the Keystone Academy. It's on South 15th Street. It's right in the middle of housing projects. The kids come from the very low income households, and they're almost all minority kids. And to see what can be done with kids, again, at 2 and 2.5 years, even 1.5 years old, and how advanced they are with their social skills, their communication skills, their creativity, it's just amazing. And every child ought to have access to that in this country. I mean, again, I think it's kind of, I think that's the real moonshot in the country is trying to get that done. And the final one was, I forget the third
I think
one,
the individual mandate.
individual mandate. Yeah. So Republicans eliminated the individual mandate, which was put in the Affordable Care Act. And the idea was at the time that that in order to make insurance reasonably priced for everyone, you have to have healthy people in the insurance system as well as less healthy people. And so we put in the original bill, we put a penalty, a financial penalty, if you didn't buy insurance. It was never enforced. I don't think any one person was ever fined under it. And then the Trump administration eliminated it. I don't think there's any real interest in reviving it because the research that has been done has basically said it didn't make much difference. It didn't make them enough of a difference to have the program where you actually had to go out and enforce it and create an administrative system to do it. So I don't think you're going to see a return of the individual mandate.
Well, thank you. So I just want to sum up your answers to some of these questions because you're giving us a new perspective. When we think about the existential crises facing our nation, everyone in this room might have a different answer. Some might say terrorism and cyber attacks. Others would say climate change. Others would say social and economic inequality. Why don't we frame more of these issues in terms of an existential crisis or the national interest, such as preschool? Why don't we hear about the economic impact? If what you're saying is true, it sounds like it would not be the most expensive item on the budget to fund all children 100% for preschool to be ready to read in kindergarten. A lot of studies in JCPS, for example, in your own district say that only 50% of kindergartners are ready to learn what kindergartners are supposed to know on day one. What would make that a national priority?
Well, obviously presidential leadership is one thing. I don't believe that that's the top priority for President Biden, but he has a lot of very immediately pressing needs, like fighting the pandemic, but he's he's dealing with climate change, which is another existential threat to the world and certainly to our society. He's treating that in I think appropriately, and that's critical. And I think the same thing needs to be done with preschool education, and hopefully if he can get these other crises taken care of. One of the things I say is when I talk about the early childhood education piece is we're now at a point, sometime last year, a baby was born who was the first non-white majority baby born. So from that point on, the majority of children born in this country are non-white. By definition, by the numbers, those children will be disproportionately under-resourced. And which also means that a generation from now and 2 generations from now, the majority of the workforce will come from that population. And that's why I think that it's urgent, because every child we let drift behind, to use the Bush administration terminology, is a child that's not going to be ready to cope with the demands of employers and the demands of the changing economy. And again, they're going to be the majority of the workforce and the majority of the tax base. And so, I've heard one person put it this way: if white people want to retire comfortably at a reasonable age, they better damn well make sure that every child has a great educational foundation, because they're going to be the ones paying for your retirement and to the tax base and so forth. Anyway, the other thing I think is really, and this is something that, again, this is not just the federal government. As a matter of fact, it's probably less the federal government than the private sector. But we have to figure out how we're going to deal with artificial intelligence and the the enormous disruptive force it's going to be in society. With ethical questions, economic questions, ethical questions, it's already changing the world. Just to put it in perspective, I talked to somebody from IBM a year ago who said in the next 3 years alone, 120 million jobs around the world will be eliminated or significantly changed by artificial intelligence. So we're in year 2 of that prediction. And we all know, for instance, that 170,000 truck driving jobs are going to disappear over the next decade because they're going to be self-driving trucks. But that's just one example. And so, there needs to be, I think, a nationwide discussion about how we're going to deal with artificial intelligence and all the manifestations of the changes that are going to happen.
Well, that brings up a question. So Emily asks in the chat, in economic theory, wages should not exceed the marginal product of one's labor. So if you cannot produce a good or service at least worth your wage, why would anybody employ you? So Emily's question is interesting regarding artificial intelligence. Is the purpose of the minimum wage to get a fair wage, or is it a different version of pumping up the ability of the demand economy? In other words, people who make the minimum wage, it's not just about making a fair wage for the labor, it's about having money to spend, because people who make the minimum wage are not going to be saving, they're going to be spending, and that's money spent on rent, on food, on all the necessities in every community.
Right. I think it's both.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is an element of the demand curve in the economy, but it's also I would describe it this way. It's a recognition that capitalism has some fundamental flaws, and one of them is the pricing of labor. And so I just tell this quick anecdote because it was so meaningful to me. Last summer, the pandemic was taking its toll, and I was on a call with some labor union people, and one of them was a maintenance worker at Seneca High School. His name was Greg. And Greg was talking about what he was doing and so forth. And it occurred to me while I was talking to him that until a few months before that, there's not one person in the world who would have ever thought about Greg or his job. But all of a sudden, when we're trying to get kids back in school and we start looking at people like Greg who are going to be keeping the school sanitized, Greg's become a much more important person. And I don't know whether Greg was white, black, brown, or whatever, but I know he wasn't making $15 an hour. And I was thinking, that we can say it about bus drivers, we can say that about grocery store shelf stockers, and all those people who all of a sudden became critical employees, essential workers, and that we don't value their work the same way we would use that formula, right? That Elizabeth mentioned. And so, and then there's the other part of it, which is the Andrew Yang element, which is everybody deserves to have an income, whether they work or not. And if they're living in this country, we want them to have a roof over their head and be able to eat. So we have to have basic guaranteed income. So there are just a lot of elements to that discussion. But I think in relation to her question, the issue of how we value work, the idea that my former college classmate, Stephen Schwartzman, can make $600+ million a year, while somebody, and probably really doesn't work 20 hours a week now, because he's in what's called the rental income, where he's just making money on his money. He's not producing anything right now. And that somebody like Greg is making probably $11 or $12 an hour keeping kids safe, clean. I hope that that's one of the kind of the positive outcomes of this whole crisis, is that we start thinking about how we compensate people in their work. And it can't be just because they add a certain percentage of productivity.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Siri wanted to respond.
I know. That was beautifully timed, Mr. Chairman. A question that we've gotten in the chat a couple of times. I cannot say that I understand the question fully, but I will tell you I've heard of this topic, which is about GameStop and Reddit. I will say no more. Do you even know what I just said? Okay.
I know.
Ben, okay, I'm going to turn it over to Ben. Did you ask that question? And I know there are a lot of people on the call who understand what I just said. Ben, you take it over and ask it properly.
So I believe this one comes from Malcolm, but there's been some unusual market activity over the past few days related to short selling and retail investors countering hedge funds. I was wondering if maybe you could talk about some of the market impacts or potential regulations that might result from unusual trading activity.
Yeah, so I don't know a lot about this, but I know a little bit enough to be dangerous. So you can, I hope that everybody knows what short selling is. You can bet on that a stock's going to go down as well as betting on it to go up. There are a lot of people, particularly in the high tech field, who believe that a lot of the high tech stocks are overpriced, and they bet on them going down. So they sold short or bought options for them to betting that they would go down. There's kind of a vigilante investment group. Apparently, these are really wealthy people who decide to stick it to the hedge fund guys, and they've gone in and driven these prices up so that their losses betting, so that they lost money betting on them to go down. One stock today went up 170%, I think, and that was yesterday, but because the market got clobbered today. But that's causing, I think, right now, a lot of volatility in the markets, because, and the theory being is a lot of these hedge fund people were buying a lot of stock in these high tech companies which had no earnings. And so they were overpriced because everybody thinks they can catch a shooting star in the market with high tech stocks. And so they got up high, and then they basically said, okay, these are too high up. We're going to bet them on the way down because they're all going to go down. And then this vigilante group came up and said, we're not going to let you. We're going to cost you a lot of money. That's the way I understand it being done. It's almost hilarious because it's very, very wealthy people, insanely wealthy people, basically screwing with each other. I mean, that's what it is. But it does have, I mean, ultimately that won't last. The one thing about the stock market is that it does find an equilibrium generally. So I would think in a couple of days, that kind of activity will be over.
Well, speaking of government intervention in the free market, I'm sorry, Ben, I did confuse your question with Malcolm. So Malcolm, my apologies. Ben asked, do you believe the Biden administration has the appetite to take on big tech through market regulation and antitrust enforcement?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure. And I'm not sure we do in Congress. I mean, people talk a big game, but and we've had last 2 years, had numerous hearings in Congress about that. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg was on the Hill an awful lot. Sheryl Sandberg was on from Facebook. They were all hauled up to the Hill for hearings a number of times. And nobody has yet, that I'm aware of, proposed any legislation to regulate them or to break them up. So, the problem with breaking up high tech is that they can be anywhere. So you could, years ago, you could break up AT&T when it was the monopoly phone company in the country, because there weren't cell phones then. They had all their wires hung, and all of their assets were in the United States, and they couldn't move. Facebook can be located anywhere it wants. Twitter can, Google can. So, you know, I'm not sure the antitrust vehicle is particularly relevant to high tech. And again, we've got lots of people screaming about it, not just Democrats, and but I don't think anybody knows exactly what to do about it.
So
They may be too big to deal with. I mean, there were certainly one time we had banks that were too big to fail. That was 2008, and now we may have tech companies that are too big to. They may be bigger than the government.
well, in our last few minutes, we're waiting for some more questions, but I want to bring back to the big picture. One is that we study the Constitution, but it doesn't always give us guidance on things that are unimaginable to the people who frame the document. So we have the longest living constitutional democracy in the world, and we're living within a house, a structural framework built by people who could not have imagined anything that we have in our lives today. Does the Constitution still fit, Mr. Chairman, or do we need to have more attention to the modern day challenges that could not have been envisioned, even though we are clearly interpreting the words and the powers of the government in our 21st century?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. Clearly, the founding fathers could not have anticipated the way the country would develop, how humanity would develop. But they did anticipate that they couldn't anticipate it. So, they provided for a mechanism for amending the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson said that the Constitution should be reevaluated, I think, every 30 years or something like that. And we've really never done that. I once started writing a column about the need for a second constitutional convention. And we aren't far away from having that. If 38 states in their legislature request a constitutional convention, we have to have one. I think 34 already have. If you want to see a Donnybrook, I mean, what happens to the Second Amendment in a constitutional convention? What happened? Well, you can almost go. Do two states get senators in a new constitutional convention? Would there be term limits on members of Congress? There's so many questions that I think would be fascinating to debate. And the issue for me would be, could you get it? Whatever came out of that process, could you get it ratified by 38 states? So in a very, very kind of perverse curiosity sense, I would love to see us have a national debate about what the Constitution should be. But I'm not sure in this current environment that it wouldn't be one of the worst things that ever happened to the country. So,
okay,
as many problems as I think there are with the existing Constitution, I'm not sure that I want to have that tested right now.
So in this environment where we have structures built by the Constitution, meaning the differences between the House and Senate, including the cycles of election, how many representatives are proportionate or not in the cases of the House and Senate respectively. Right. The Electoral College has gotten a lot of renewed attention, lifetime terms for federal judges of all levels.
Yep.
These are the structures we live in, but voters determine the policy direction that the people within those structures debate and pass. So what is the role of the voter? We've had a lot of attention to voters recently. I know we have a lot of college and high school students on this call right now. Without using any cliches, can you really tell us what the value of the civic right to vote means for a lot of the questions and the topics that we've discussed tonight.
Yeah, so we have a member who was elected from Georgia named Marjorie Taylor Greene, who 2 years ago and a year ago put out a tweet saying that we ought to shoot Nancy Pelosi in the face. She's a QAnon conspirator adherent. She believes that Democrats are this massive pedophilia organization. And she's a member of Congress. And the voters knew that. I mean, it wasn't a secret that she was a QAnon supporter when she was running. On the other hand, we have a new member from Iowa who was elected by 6 votes out of, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands cast, but she represents a district with roughly 700,000 people, and 6 votes separated her from her. She's a Republican from her Democratic opponent. So it's clear that voters do make a difference as to who gets into these offices, and every vote does count. We have another race in New York that still hasn't been decided, and it's in the scores of votes. It's not 6, but it's in the, I think it's like 80 votes now or something different. My good friend Joe Courtney, when he was elected in 2006 from a district in Connecticut, he won by 92 votes. And so the idea that that it doesn't matter. Well, Matt Bevin, when he was elected, when he won the Republican primary in 2015 in Kentucky, he won by, I think, 81 or 2 votes over Jamie Comer. So votes do count. And ultimately, as has been proven time after time after time, that turnout is really what matters. It's generally not television ads. It's not how much money you spend. It's how you can get people to come to the polls. And then the other part of that is making sure that we have at least an adequate civic education so people know what they're, not necessarily every detail about the lives or positions of their candidates, but they know what they're voting for. You know, I preach all the time to, when I go to schools, and although I haven't been to many recently, but wherever I go, to kids as young as 9 or 10 years old, when you go to vote, when you turn 18, make sure you vote for every office, and you consider that, because yeah, I mean, most of the attention is focused on federal office, but the people who determine what happens in your life day to day most directly are your Metro Council people, your state representatives, your local judges, your local school board. Those are the people who directly affect your life every day, and they get the least attention. So, you know, we've done a pitiful job in recent generations of educating, of giving great civic education to our young people. You do a great job, Jasmine, with college students, but by the time you're they're in your class, they already care. And we still have 35–40% of the public who don't even care enough to vote. And that's sad. And elections have consequences. I think if we've learned anything over the last 4, 6, 10, 12 years, elections make a difference. And, you know, if you're a dreamer, it made a difference when Donald Trump was president. It made a difference in your life because you were scared to death that you were going to get deported at any moment. You probably feel a lot better now that Joe Biden's president. And, you know, that's just one example of how elections have consequences. So,
Okay.
and democracy doesn't work unless the voters care.
Right.
It doesn't work.
That's right. So a final thought, let's try to end on a positive note. Do you have conversations with your colleagues along these lines? Because the stereotype about members of the House and Senate is that they don't live in Washington as much as they used to, or they have short weeks, short visits. They're going to get in trouble if they're not home, so you have to be home. But if you're home, you're not there. And when you're not there, you're not engaging your colleagues, you're not using your power and authority for your district. And it's a very difficult tug when there are only 24 hours in the day. But assuming that you find the magic formula of representing while also being present in your district, do you have these types of conversations with your colleagues across the aisle or even within your own party?
We definitely have them within our own party. Across the aisle, it's rare. Although it happens. When I went to the inauguration last week, a friend of mine who's a senior Republican member said, "Hey, come over to my office afterwards. We're going to be drinking bourbon and smoking cigars." And I said, "Well, I don't smoke cigars, but I do drink bourbon." So I went over, and for an hour, he and another Republican member and we had wonderful conversations. We had wonderful conversations about subjects like this, about voters, and about how we both of them were just thrilled. The reason they were drinking bourbon is that they were thrilled that Donald Trump was gone. That's why I'm not naming them, because they'll get in trouble. But so it happens, but it's not common. It's not common, and that's a shame. I'll tell one quick story about this. I have somebody I really grew to appreciate over the last few years, a guy named Rob Woodall, who was a Republican congressman from Georgia, and he retired after the last term. But I remember and he's a very smart guy. We don't agree on much. I mean, he was very conservative, but one day we were walking back from the floor together. We were talking about one aspect of healthcare, and I can't even remember what it was. And he said, I think here's what we need to do. We need to do this, 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 this. I said, no, I don't think so. I think we need to do this and this, this, this. And we stopped and looked at each other, and we said, we actually just said the same thing. We just used the words of our partisan words, but there was practically no difference between what we said. And I've told that story many times. He has too, because it was kind of a revelation that sometimes we scream at each other and yell, and we actually aren't very far apart. Although the outside world makes it very difficult for us to compromise, and that's one of the problems we have. And this relates to the voters as well. In this particular period, nobody gets rewarded for compromising. And until politicians are rewarded for accommodating other views and compromising, they won't.
That's a great way to conclude. And I will quote the former speaker, John Boehner, whom you mentioned earlier. Dr. Gregg, you'll remember this when John Boehner came to the McConnell Center, maybe it was about 2009, 2010, about the time he became speaker. And I remember his saying this vividly, just what you said. There's no reward for compromise if compromise is viewed as ceding your principles and diluting the reason that the voters put you in office. So instead, he proposed a new ideal called common ground. Common ground is the natural part where the Venn diagram happens. And that's the magic, because it's not a compromise. It's why don't we start with that? It's a simple thought, but it was a profound one, and it stuck with me. On that note, I do want to allow everyone an opportunity to unmute your mics if you can, or if not, just make the noise in the little box. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks.
And thank you very
Thank you.
much.
It was fun. No, it was fun. And I'll see
Thank
you
you.
tomorrow.
I'll see you tomorrow at 8 o'clock in our class. Dr. Gregg, thank you for hosting this. Thank you very much, Ben, for emceeing. Thank you for current students, former students, students who are now asking to be admitted to the Zoom room, and of course, our really loyal colleagues here at UofL. This is such a wonderful opportunity. I have enjoyed it immensely. Thank you all for your really brilliant questions. feel free to find me anytime if you have any follow-ups. Dr. Gregg or Ben, would you like to wrap it up?
Yes, ma'am. Well, thank you, Congressman Yarmuth and Dr. Farrier for spending your evening with us. This marks the conclusion of our public lecture. We invite everyone to join us on February 15th for a talk with Dr. Nathan Coleman on the historical origins of sovereignty and federalism in the United States. Visit mcconnellcenter.org for more details. Thank you all for joining us online, and have a great rest of your evening.
And go Cards.
Go Cards.
9 o'clock.